A tree branch touches a power line in Ohio. That's the story you've heard. A branch, a spark, and 50 million people plunged into darkness across 2 countries. And it's true, that part actually happened. But the tree isn't why New York City went black. The tree isn't why trains stopped dead between stations in Toronto, or why people were trapped in elevators in Detroit for hours in the August heat. A room full of trained engineers did that. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. For almost an hour, the very system built to warn them had gone completely silent, and not one of them knew it. This is the story of how the largest blackout in North American history happened, not because of one catastrophic decision, but because of a dozen small, forgivable ones, stacked quietly on top of each other until there was nothing left holding the system up. August 14th, 2003. A Thursday. The kind of oppressive, humid heat that settles over the Midwest in late summer and doesn't let go. Air conditioners humming in every building from Cleveland to Toronto, all drawing power at once. And on a day like that, the electrical grid is already working near its limit. Because electricity is strange that way, it can't really be stockpiled. It has to be generated the exact instant it's consumed, balanced constantly, like a tightrope walker who's never allowed to stop moving. Add heat, add demand, and that tightrope gets thinner. At the center of this is a company called First Energy, headquartered in Akron, Ohio. And to understand what went wrong that day, you have to understand what kind of world First Energy was operating in. A few years earlier, the entire electricity industry across the US had been restructured. Deregulation, it was called. The old model, where a single utility built the plant, owned the wires, and answered for the whole system top to bottom, was being dismantled. In its place came something more fractured. Power was now bought and sold across state lines like a commodity. Traded for profit, generation split apart from transmission. Everyone in the industry was chasing efficiency, everyone was cutting cost wherever cost could be cut. And wires. Actual physical wires strung through forests and farmland, and the trees quietly growing underneath them are not where profit lives. Nobody gets promoted for trimming a tree. Nobody impresses shareholders with a well-maintained right-of-way. It's invisible work, expensive work, the kind of expense that's painfully easy to defer for one more budget cycle. And one more after that. That's the world this story begins in. Not a single villain, not a single reckless act, just an industry quietly optimizing itself in a direction it didn't fully understand the danger of. A system stretched thin by heat, stretched thin by demand, and maintained by a company that, like most of its peers at the time, was learning to do more with less. Now watch how a hot afternoon in Ohio turns into a catastrophe that reaches New York City in under 7 minutes. At 1:31 in the afternoon, a coal-fired generating unit at First Energy's East Lake plant, sitting right on the shore of Lake Erie, trips offline. The operator there had pushed the unit to produce more reactive power than its equipment could comfortably handle, trying to prop up sagging voltage elsewhere on the system, and its own protective controls shut it down before it could damage itself. One power plant, gone, on the hottest, highest demand afternoon of the summer. Not a disaster on its own, but it meant less generation near Cleveland, which meant the electricity that plant used to provide now had to come from somewhere else, pulled harder through whatever lines were left standing. Therefore, the load shifted onto Ohio's high-voltage backbone, a set of massive transmission corridors cutting through rural land, corridors that ran, in more than a few places, straight through trees nobody had gotten around to trimming. And this is where the deferred maintenance from years earlier finally comes due. Those trees weren't some wild, neglected jungle. They were just ordinary trees doing what trees do every summer, growing a little taller, reaching a little closer to the lines above them, while the budget for keeping that gap safe kept sliding down the priority list. And heat makes it worse. Power lines sag when they heat up. The metal literally expands and stretches, dropping lower than it sits on a cool day. Push more current through a hot line, and it heats up even further, sagging even more. Combine that sag with branches that had crept just a few feet too close, and you get contact. Not an explosion, just electricity finding a shorter, unintended path to the ground through a tree, and the line tripping itself offline to keep from melting. At 2:02 in the afternoon, a massive line called Harding-Chamberlain sags into a tree and trips. One major line down. The grid automatically and instantly reroutes that power through the remaining nearby lines. Therefore, those lines now carry more current than they were ever meant to carry on a normal day. More current means more heat. More heat means more sag. It's a debt being quietly transferred from one wire to the next, and nobody's collecting on it yet. But here's the moment that turns this from an engineering problem into something far darker. Somewhere around 2:14 that afternoon, the alarm system inside First Energy's control room, the software specifically built to flag exactly this kind of event, to light up a screen and sound a tone the instant something on the grid fails, quietly stopped working. It didn't crash with an error message. It didn't announce its own death. It just stalled, silently, choked by what engineers would later call a race condition, two internal processes competing to update the same piece of information at the exact same moment, and neither one finishing cleanly. The alarm system froze in place, and because it froze silently, nobody in that control room had any reason to suspect a thing. Think about what that actually means. You're a pilot flying at night, and your instrument panel looks completely normal, the dials are lit, the numbers are moving, except somebody has quietly disconnected the warning lights. You're not flying blind because you can't see anything. You're flying blind because the one system built to tell you where to look has gone mute, and you don't even know enough to ask the question. At 3:32 in the afternoon, a second major line, Hannah Juniper, sags into vegetation and trips, exactly the way the first one did. Two critical transmission lines down within 90 minutes of each other. And the operators responsible for the entire regional grid still don't know either failure happened. What they did notice was that some of their screens seemed sluggish, slow to refresh, behaving a little strangely. So they called their IT support line. Ordinary troubleshooting, the kind that happens in offices every single day. Nobody was alarmed because nothing on their screens looked alarming. The deeper cruelty of it is almost unbearable. The data showing two lines had failed was technically sitting inside the system the whole time. Retrievable if you knew exactly where to dig. But retrievable isn't the same as visible. And in a control room, watching dozens of numbers shift every second, the gap between technically available somewhere in the system and actually seen by a human being is the entire distance between catching a falling building and standing directly underneath it. Somewhere out there, a third line is already starting to sag, and the people whose job is to see it coming are still on hold with tech support. Here's the part that turns this from an Ohio problem into a continental one. Every single time one of those lines went down, the electricity that used to flow through it didn't just vanish into thin air. It had to go somewhere else. Instantly, because that's how power behaves. It doesn't ask permission, it obeys physics, redistributing itself across whatever conductors are still standing. Picture a highway during rush hour, where two lanes suddenly close. The number of cars hasn't changed. They just get crammed into fewer lanes. And those remaining lanes start to strain under weight they were never designed to carry alone. That's what was happening to Ohio's grid in real time, except the cars were ampers, and the lanes were steel cables slowly heating past their limits. By mid-afternoon, voltage across the Cleveland and Akron area had sagged badly enough that neighboring utilities started noticing something was wrong on their end of the system. Phones started ringing. Grid operators from surrounding regions were calling First Energy, asking essentially what is happening over there. And this is one of the quietest, most devastating details in the entire event. The people answering those calls didn't actually know either, because the fog wasn't just inside First Energy's control room. The regional body responsible for overseeing the broader grid, an organization called MISO, ran its own software specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of spreading failure. A tool called a state estimator, which continuously models the health of the entire interconnected system. And earlier that day, MISO's state estimator had also failed, and hadn't been properly restarted. So the one layer of oversight built specifically to catch a single utility's blind spot had its own blind spot at the exact same time. Two separate safety nets, both quietly torn, and nobody standing beneath them had noticed either hole. Now stack the picture in your head. A power plant trips, straining the system, trees left untrimmed for years because trimming doesn't show up as revenue, bring down two major lines. An obscure software bug silences the primary alarm system at the worst conceivable moment. And the regional safety net meant to catch precisely this kind of blind spot is blind too. 4 separate points of human oversight, all compromised, all on the same sweltering Thursday afternoon, and not one person in any of those rooms has done anything you could point to and call reckless. That's what should genuinely unsettle you about this story. There was no single dramatic failure, just years of smaller ones, quietly compounding, each one invisible in isolation. At 3:41 in the afternoon, a third line, Star South Canton, sags into a tree exactly like the two before it, and trips. 3 major transmission lines down in barely 2 hours, and the system is now carrying its remaining load through fewer and fewer paths, each one hotter, each one closer to its own breaking point. To understand what happens next, you need to understand one more piece of engineering, the protective relay. Every major line and transformer on the grid has one, and its entire job is simple, almost primal. The instant it senses conditions that could destroy the equipment it's guarding, it disconnects that equipment immediately, automatically, with no human involved at all. Think of it like a circuit breaker in your house, except scaled up to handle enough electricity to power a city and reacting in a fraction of a second. On a normal day, this is a good thing. It's the system protecting itself from damage. But when dozens of these relays start firing in sequence, each one shedding load onto whatever's left, each disconnection making the remaining system even more overloaded than before. You get something closer to falling dominoes than to safety. And by 4 in the afternoon, Ohio's grid has almost no dominoes left standing. One more major line is still absorbing far more current than it should ever have to carry alone. A line called Samus Star, now compensating for 3 failed neighbors at once, humming under a burden that was never part of its design. Every safeguard that should have caught this earlier has already failed silently, one after another, hours ago. The operators are still troubleshooting a computer glitch, and nobody, anywhere in that control room, has any idea that the entire eastern half of the continent is about to feel what happens next. At 4:05 in the afternoon, the Samus Star line finally gives out. It sags, it strikes vegetation exactly like the 3 lines before it, and it trips, except this one is different. This wasn't just another line going down. This was the last real buffer the system had left in the region, the final path capable of absorbing the load the others had already dumped onto it. And the moment it disconnects, there is nothing left standing between a strained regional grid and a full continental collapse. From this point forward, everything accelerates past the point where any human being could realistically intervene. What had unfolded as a slow, quiet 2.5-hour drift toward disaster becomes, in the next 7 minutes, an unstoppable chain reaction. Here's the physics of what a cascading failure actually looks like, stripped down to something you can picture. Imagine a crowded room where suddenly one exit gets sealed off. The people don't disappear, they surge toward the remaining doors, all at once, overwhelming them too. Now imagine those overwhelmed doors seal themselves shut automatically the instant too much pressure builds against them, because that's exactly what they're designed to do to keep from being torn off their hinges. Each sealed door makes the crowd's problem worse, funneling more pressure onto whatever doors are left. That is essentially what happened to the electrical grid of the northeastern United States and Ontario in the minutes after 4:05 p.m. Massive surges of power, suddenly without anywhere sanctioned to go, went hunting for any path they could find, and the automatic protective relays across an enormous geographic area began firing in response faster than any dispatcher could track, let alone stop. Power plants across Michigan began tripping offline within minutes, their own relays sensing the wild, dangerous swings in frequency and voltage, now radiating outward through the interconnected system and shutting themselves down to avoid destruction. The disturbance didn't stop at a state line. It doesn't recognize state lines, and it rolled north into Ontario, where Canadian grid operators watched their own systems begin automatically shedding load and disconnecting generators in a last, desperate act of self-preservation. Machines protecting themselves with no time for a human to weigh in. By 4:10, the wave had pushed east into Pennsylvania. By 4:13, it reached New York. Consolidated Edison, the utility responsible for keeping New York City powered, watched its connections to the rest of the eastern grid disintegrate in real time as protective relays fired one after another to isolate the city from a regional system that had become too unstable to remain tied to. And within those few final minutes, not hours, minutes, 8 U.S. states and the entire Canadian province of Ontario went dark. Cleveland, Detroit, Toronto, Ottawa, New York City, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million people, across 2 countries, lost power within a span of time shorter than it takes to watch a sitcom episode. Try to actually picture what that looked like at ground level, not as a statistic in a report, but as an ordinary Thursday evening interrupted mid-sentence. In New York, subway trains stopped dead between stations, and transit workers had to walk passengers out along darkened tracks by flashlight. Traffic lights across entire cities, Manhattan, Detroit, Toronto, simply went dark all at once. And for a few surreal hours, ordinary people stood in intersections directing traffic with nothing but hand gestures and patience, because there was nobody else to do it. Airports shut runways and terminals. Water systems in some cities lost pressure entirely, because the pumps that move water depend on the same grid that had just collapsed underneath them. People were trapped in elevators for hours, banging on doors in the dark, waiting for rescue crews who were suddenly needed everywhere at once. Hospitals switched over to backup generators and started doing the math on how many hours of fuel they actually had left. And across the entire affected region, as the heat of the day finally started to break into evening, hundreds of thousands of people simply started walking out of office towers, down 40 flights of stairs in the dark, walking across bridges into Brooklyn and Queens because the trains weren't running and the roads were already gridlocked beyond any hope of moving, walking home for miles in dress shoes because there was genuinely nothing else left to do. Somewhere in a control room in Ohio, an operator was still staring at a screen that technically still looked fine. It took most of a full day to bring power back to large parts of the region, and in some pockets, closer to 2 full days before things were genuinely stable again. When investigators finished counting the cost, they attributed roughly 11 deaths to the blackout, not from the darkness itself, but from everything the darkness triggered. Carbon monoxide poisoning from generators run in poorly ventilated rooms. A drowning, cases where medical equipment at home or in understaffed facilities failed at exactly the wrong moment. The financial toll, tallied across the United States and Canada together, landed somewhere around $6 billion once you factor in lost business, spoiled inventory, emergency overtime, and the sheer economic friction of stopping 50 million people in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. And when the joint US and Canadian task force finally published its findings, months later, the language in that report wasn't really about trees. It wasn't really about a software bug either. Not fundamentally, it was about a pattern. First Energy, the investigators concluded, had failed to adequately manage vegetation along its transmission corridors, a failure that had been building quietly for years. It had failed to properly maintain the very software tools its own operators depended on for basic situational awareness. And it had failed to train its staff to recognize a slowly unfolding emergency without an alarm system doing the recognizing for them, because nobody had ever seriously rehearsed a scenario where the alarms themselves go silent. The regional oversight tools had failed too, and nobody outside First Energy caught the deterioration in time to stop it, for a reason that's almost more unsettling than any single broken part. The entire system for enforcing grid reliability standards across North America, at that point in history, was essentially voluntary. Utilities were expected to follow good practice. There was encouragement, there were guidelines, but there was no meaningful penalty if a company quietly decided that trimming trees or stress testing alarm software could wait one more budget cycle. And in an industry that had just been restructured around competition and cost-cutting, voluntary turned out to mean exactly what you'd expect it to mean. That's the uncomfortable center of this entire event. The thing that makes it so different from the disaster story you probably expected walking in. There was no single villain here. No one engineer who ignored a screaming red light and pressed a button anyway. No boardroom decision made in obvious bad faith. It was smaller compromises, made honestly, made reasonably. At the time, a tree left untrimmed because trimming doesn't generate revenue and the budget was already stretched thin. A piece of alarm software nobody had ever stress tested against the exact, unlikely combination of failures that occurred that particular afternoon. A regulatory system built on trust, in an industry that had just been reorganized around squeezing out every possible cost. None of it looked dangerous on its own. All of it was dangerous together, and it took the largest blackout in North American history to prove that. In the years that followed, mandatory reliability standards were finally written into law, enforceable ones backed by real financial penalties, the kind the industry had spent years quietly resisting on the grounds that they were unnecessary, expensive, redundant. It took 50 million people losing power in under 9 minutes to prove otherwise. The tree branch was real. It genuinely happened, exactly the way the popular version of the story tells it. But it was never really about the tree. It was about every person, at every level of that system, who looked at the growing gap between a branch and a high-voltage wire, year after year, and quietly decided it could wait one more season.